This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast dealing with the dark feminine. I'm your host, Breach Burke. This week we are going to talk about water hags, or water spirits. In particular, we're going to talk about two, Peg Powler and Jenny Greenteeth, who are probably, arguably, two versions of the exact same, the same fairy or the same type of fairy. Now, Peg Powler and Jenny Greenteeth belong to a class of what we call creatures or fairies that come from northern England, particularly Yorkshire and Lancashire. And they're referred to as Grindylows. And the name Grindylow is thought to be connected to Grendel, which is the monstrous figure in Beowulf that Beowulf actually has to do battle with because it is killing and dragging warriors away. He kills Grendel and then faces Grendel's mother. However, the Grindylow is specific to dealing with bogs, lakes, rivers, and in the way they're described here, they're diminutive humans with scaly skin, greenish complexion, sharp claws and teeth, and long wiry arms with lengthy fingers at the end. They dwell in ponds and marshes, waiting for children to come by. When they spot some children, they grab them with their shockingly strong grip and drag them under the surface of the waters. It says Grindylows have been used as shadow figures to frighten children away from pools, marshes, or ponds. And of course, it's mentioned that if you've read the Harry Potter books, which I'm not going to lie to you, I haven't because I'm just not really interested in them. But Grindylows apparently appear there. And then they also have appeared, they appear in role-playing games, they appear in other novels and series. And they're basically a kind of evil aquatic monster. Now, Peg Powler is associated with a particular river in the between Yorkshire and Lancashire called the River Tees, and Jenny Greenteeth is associated with another river called the River Ribble, Ribble. And these are both northern England. And so I think what we want to examine in this podcast in talking about these two figures is, first of all, who are they? What are they supposed to do? And then then talking about kind of the initial idea about these as being sort of cautionary tales, that the idea of these fairies that are going to drag you under the water. They're not the only ones, by the way. There are several categories of water spirit. The Grindylows are common to England, but there are other ones that we'll talk about, at least briefly, from other cultures. And it's there are similar figures to the Jenny Greenteeth and Peg Powlers, who also go by a multitude of other names. But they will. So we want to talk about that. So we want to talk about sort of the obvious idea of the cautionary tale, but then also I want to look at an alternate view of what they may have to do with drowning, or similar to the way that fairies can tend to be blamed for other kinds of things, the way in which these figures might actually be an explanation for drowning in certain cases. And there's an argument that's made for that. Then we also want to look. Then there's a third idea about these figures as initiatory figures. But then we also want to look at them. But I think also in that more transformative or liminal context, we can look at these figures with relation to water and how and what water does, and also also restless dead figures that are ancient, like as we had spoken about the Aori in another podcast, how they might resemble figures like Marmo or Gello or Lamia from ancient Greece. So to begin, so we've talked about what a Grindylow is. Now, Peg Powler, she's a hag and water spirit in English folklore who inhabits the River Tees. She's similar to the Grindylow, Jenny Greenteeth, and Nelly Longarms is yet another name. She drags children into the water if they get too close to the edge. She's regarded as a bogeyman figure who is invoked by parents to frighten children into proper behavior. The 19th century folklorist William Henderson describes Peg Powler as having green hair and an insatiable desire for human life, and she is said to lure people into the river to drown or be devoured. Okay, so that's mentioned too. I hadn't really known whether it was really a cannibalistic element to them or whether they simply like to drown people, but apparently, at least in some versions, there's a cannibalistic view as well. The foam or froth, which is seen floating on certain part of the teas, is called Peg Powler's suds or Peg Powler's cream. A similar creature called Nanny Powler is said to haunt the river Skern, a tributary of the Tees. Michael Denham regards her as either the sister or daughter of Peg Powler. And Elliot O'Donnell, who wrote all the rather famous and dubious ghost stories in 1924, he describes her as a spirit who lures men and boys to their doom in the river Tees by appearing as a beautiful young woman with green hair, pretending to drown so that her victim will enter the water and attempt to save her. She may even appear on land on foggy nights and lead men astray until they stumble into the river. The Peg Powler myth is at the heart of the acclaimed novel Ironopolis. Okay, so I'm taking that from Wikipedia. And if we look at Jenny Greenteeth, we see her also known as Wicked Jenny, or Ginny Greenteeth, from Virginia. Ginny is a figure in English folklore as a river hag similar to Peg Powler, which would pull children, or the elderly in this case, into the water and drown them. Okay, so that's a little bit of a twist, is the elderly. The name is also used to describe pondweed or duckweed. If you've ever seen a duckweed-choked pond, you do kind of have this idea of, if it moves, like there could be some figure with long, slimy hair, ready to reach it and grab you. It says it can form a continuous mat over the surface of a small body of water, making it misleading and potentially treacherous, especially to unwary children. With this meaning, the name is common in Liverpool and southwest Lancashire. Okay, so said she also is described as green skin with long hair and sharp teeth, so they all fit the Grindylow paradigm. She's called Ginny Greenteeth in Lancashire and North Staffordshire, but in Cheshire and Shropshire she's called Wicked Jenny. Ginny Greenteeth or Jeanie Greenteeth. She's also described as lurking in the upper branches of trees at night, although this may be a folklorist's confusion with the Northern English Ginny Hewlett, which is a folk name for an owl. Okay. Now, what I find interesting here is the similar figures to these other Grindylows. She says she's likely to be an invention to frighten children from dangerous waters, similar to the Rusalka, which is from the Slavic countries, the Kappa in Japanese myth, or the Bunyip in Australia. But one folklorist sees her as a memory of sacrificial practices. Okay, so that's interesting, and that actually ties in a way with another theory that I've heard. A similar figure in Jamaican folklore is called the River Mumma. I'm not sure I'm saying that right, but it's Mumma, or the River Mother. She's said to live at the fountainhead of large rivers in Jamaica, sitting on top of a rock, combing her long black hair with a gold comb. She usually appears at midday, and she disappears if she observes anyone approaching. However, if an intruder sees her first and their eyes meet, terrible things will happen to the intruder. Similar figure known as the Storm Hag appears in American folklore around Lake Erie, specifically in the urban legends of Erie, Pennsylvania, in which sailors use a paranormal being to explain the dangers and shipwrecks in the Erie Quadrangle. The Storm Hag is said to be a green-skinned woman with teeth like a shark's, but green, as well as piercing yellow eyes, who rests at the bottom of the lake off the coast of the Presque Isle and sings a song whenever a ship approaches. Now that's interesting, because now we see a Jenny Greenteeth combined almost with the idea of the Greek siren, and also with the, I'm thinking of other figures like Scylla and Charybdis. Scylla and Charybdis, if you're not familiar with them, in ancient Greece, they were supposed to be two monstrous. One had, numerous heads, monstrous heads, and that would hang out almost like tentacles and would grab sailors as they went through this one particular strait. It's actually called. First, they thought it was the Strait of Messina, that it was referring to land formations in that area, but actually, it's a place called the Strait of Scylla, Skylla. And there's a number of stories of Scylla in Greek mythology, which I'm not going to get into now because I don't want to sidetrack into that. But nonetheless, you have this idea that there's this, may literally refer to this rock formation that sailors tend to get caught on and snagged, like it's a monstrous woman reaching out to grab and devour them. Or if they managed to avoid Scylla, then they had to worry about Charybdis, because if they moved the ship too far to the other side, Charybdis is a giant belching whirlpool. So if you're caught between Scylla and Charybdis, that's, by the way, the same as the expression being caught between a rock and a hard place. And it does refer to the dangers of the sea, particularly in that area. So here, we're seeing a Lake Erie thing, because Lake Erie does, can be quite a dangerous lake at times. So this has to do with the danger of shipwrecks. And there's now you have a mythological figure or folkloric figure who is attributed to, who behaves like a siren, sings a song to lure men in, and then is actually this monstrous being which is going to devour them. So this whole idea of the water monster or the sea creature of a different kind. I mean, we also know about we know about other sea monsters like the Kraken, for example, or these other kinds of Loch Ness monster, or these other monstrous sea creatures, Ogopogo. But this is a different type. This is a different class. This isn't just an ancient monster that looks like a dinosaur. These are said to be women who all share these kinds of characteristics of green skin and long claws, and they are always hags in their portrayal. They are always hags. Another version, by the way, there are also horse figures in fairy lore that will drag people down to a watery death. Most notably, the Kelpie, which is from Scottish folklore, and you also hear about him up in the islands and the Shetlands and so forth. The Kelpie is basically, and again, there's that luring idea. The Kelpie usually stands there as a horse, and if you have a traveler who's been wandering along and then suddenly sees this horse and thinks, aha, I can get on this horse and I can, get home faster. But then the horse actually, instead of taking them that way, just goes straight into the water and then drowns the rider. And it's meant to be a lure in that sense. So, as we'd mentioned in the podcast on the Aore, there is a connection between horses and these kind of hag figures of the types that are Gello, Marmo, or the Lamia Lamashtu in the ancient Babylonian. There's these association either with birds, wolves, or horses. And at least in the ancient Greek, that was always a connection to Poseidon, who, is the god of the seas, and also can, which, if not appeased, he is somebody who's very quick to temper and also can bring up terrible storms, but was also noted for some of his darker sexual escapades. We see his relationship to Medusa, which produces the Pegasus, the winged horse of Greek mythology. And also when he meets up with Demeter Erinyes, she's when Demeter in the myth of Demeter and Persephone is going to look for her daughter. She is said to be in a fury, and Erinyes refers to a furious state. So she takes this form of Demeter Erinyes, and that ends up being the form of a horse. So there's just all of these little symbolic connections between horses, between hags, and between this idea of fury, and either and death, devouring, drowning, usually children, but we also see, at least in one case here, the elderly. Okay. So what can we make of these figures? I do want to mention, incidentally, if anybody ever, because fairy lore is one of those things, like ghost lore, that there's some people who are going to look at it strictly from an academic and intellectual standpoint and say, well, yes, these things aren't real, and, they're just either meant to be cautionary tales, or they're meant to, as we've noted, represent certain archetypal or psychological states of mind. But also there's people who claim to have real experiences of real fairies. And there is an entire channel, for example, Scary Fairy Godmother, I've seen on YouTube, where she does record people's fairy sightings, that, people have actually seen them. And I'm always very curious, because I have actually, when I was staying in Avebury a couple of years ago, I actually saw some myself. Not Peg Powler, Jenny Greenteeth, but other fairy-type creatures. And so I'm always curious to know, particularly with regard to this story, if you know of any, if you've heard of any stories, you know, you're either from that part of, you know, from that part of England and you've heard stories of Jenny Greenteeth or Peg Powler, or you have somebody who you swear saw one of them or was dragged away by one of them, like supposed to be a real story. And again, I'm not, you know, I'm not being judgmental about whether I think the story is real or not. But if anybody claims to have said, no, there's a real experience, not just, you know, something mom told me to scare me off, I'd be interested to know. So if you have such a story, feel free to share it in the comments. Or if you're listening to this in the podcast form, you can always email those stories to me at Chthonia@chthonia.net. And contact me there, and I will, you know, and I, you know, because I might even do, if I actually do get some stories, I may actually do a separate follow-up episode, just because I'm always very curious. I'm not saying I'm not saying I necessarily believe or disbelieve. The likelihood may well be that these are strictly cautionary. These are ways in which people represent misfortunes as beings. But at the same time, you know, I'm always curious about when people seem to think they may have actually encountered such a thing, because I do think there's a certain reality to nature spirits and fairies as well. So, so if you happen to have a story like that, feel free to share. Okay, so not to digress too much. So we see these Peg Powler and Jenny Greenteeth as representing these kinds of these fears. Brian Froud also has them in his fairies book. He says, there are many water spirits whose sole delight is the drowning and devouring of children. Probably most of these were invented by mothers to keep their children away from riverbanks. The River Tees has one Peg Powler, and a Yorkshire river, as I mentioned, the River Ribble, is tenanted by Jenny Greenteeth. Both are green hags with long flowing hair and sharp teeth who drag their victims to watery graves. Okay, so again, following the same pattern. So the question then, okay, so then first let's look at the idea of them as cautionary tales. Now we know that England is filled with rivers, lakes, bogs, fens. There's all kinds of places that are watery in nature. Some may be treacherous and deceptive. Ones that are covered with duckweed, one might think you're on ground that's more solid than what you are. But there's also some alternate way of thinking. Now I'm looking at a blog called Hypnagogia, and where the author of this mentions talks specifically about Jenny Greenteeth, and says, and so I'll just quote from this piece. The British Isles being lands so famously green and pleasant thanks to the numerous rivers, streams, brooks, springs, ponds, lakes, lochs, meres, and tarns, naturally has a host of such drowners in its folk tales. In Ireland there's the Augusk, in Scotland the Kelpie, the Isle of Man has the Glashtin, in Wales the Morgans, and England is home to the Grindylows. Every area has its own local watery horror, and folk tales abound of water horses and river hags. In this person's own immediate area, the River Tees is said to be the home of Peg Powler, a green-skinned water witch who waits to prey upon the unwary, grabbing the careless and dragging them down to drown on the murky riverbed. But they say the most famous of these aquatic terrors is Jenny Greenteeth. Identical in all regards to Peg Powler, this hag haunted the waters of Lancashire and northwest of England and has become the poster girl for this kind of lurker in the waters. Not only has Jenny found her way into fantasy and horror fiction on numerous occasions, but tales about her were still being told well into the 20th century. For example, in some she's said to haunt recent industrial editions' canals. And he mentions that in Ridley Scott's legend, Jenny Greenteeth inspires Meg Mucklebones. And he says, in such folk tales, there's probably still being told today, nothing better to keep children away from dangerous stretches of water than a story that there is a monster waiting to drown them there. Death by drowning still accounts for a large portion of accidental deaths in children across the world, and hence scary stories about horrors that seek to drown you still serve a useful purpose. Indeed, in the 1970s, a British public information film memorably put a modern spin on this kind of cautionary folk tale, employing the vocal talents of Donald Pleasance. Yeah, I remember this was from 1973. It was called Lonely Water. And it's you can find it on YouTube. It's definitely worth checking out if you want to see creepy PSAs. We're so used to some of the ridiculous films that we saw through the 70s that were meant to be public service announcements about, I don't know, not doing drugs or about not getting into a car with strangers and all this kind of stuff. And this one, not getting too close to ponds. So it's interesting. Okay, it's long been suggested that an origin of all manners of creatures from Jenny Greenteeth to Kelpies and Kappas was in fact to warn folks away from mucking about in stretches of water. However, while there's undoubtedly some truth to the idea, they say the explanation of this is somewhat flawed. And they say the problem is that this mooted origin is the product of an age where we usually stay away from the wild waters of the countryside, born of an age where we have running water piped into our homes. But not that long ago, folks didn't have the convenience of modern plumbing and municipal waterworks. Bathing, washing clothes, or even getting a drink meant a trip to the local water source. Hence, warning folks away from the local stream or well, somewhere that you need for nearly every aspect of day-to-day living, makes little sense. However, living so close to natural waters was undoubtedly dangerous. In Tudor England, when a drink, a wash, or even a trip to the loo meant a stroll to the water's edge, drowning accounted for a whopping 40% of all accidental deaths. Therefore, when death by drowning is so common, it seems possible that maybe tales of murderous water sprites may not be somewhat impractical warnings to stay away from the water, but the proposed explanation for so many drownings. Okay, so so that's another interesting take on it. It's and that would put that actually does make a lot of sense, because it puts into the category, for example, when we see changelings, the idea that if somebody's child had a healthy baby that suddenly became sickly, they'd say, well, the fairies took the real baby away and put the substitute here. We see different ways in which these folkloric figures become explanations for certain dangers to humans. As we mentioned with the shipwrecks, you see this even as early as the Sirens, Scylla, and Charybdis. And these water hags, going into places that are potentially deep, dark, and dangerous in some way. There's some sense of depth there. Even though some rivers and streams may not be that deep, or even just the rushing of water. For example, Lynn Thurman did a presentation at the Magical Women's Conference where she talks about Jenny Greenteeth and Peg Powler, and also it talks about them in the context of Baba Yaga. And Baba Yaga, as we know, she lives far out in the woods. Okay, she represents sort of that the danger and the fearsomeness of the dense forest. Okay, and again, you have this representation of powers of nature. And Lynn had also mentioned in her talk that she felt that there may be something shamanic almost in these figures, that there may be the idea of that kind of being, quote unquote, dragged under the water might actually be, there may be something of an initiatory thing, like the idea of these hags as the gatekeepers to another world, for instance. And that's also an interesting theory, because when we think about a hag, we think about not only somebody who's ugly usually, but also somebody who's very, very old. And, and with that, there's all of the dangers of the elderly feminine, from what we see in Dhumavati in India, the old widow woman, and the dangers that type of Shakti presents. But also the way that older, that age ends up being a kind of a threat, because it reminds us of death, that life does not last forever, that youth does not last forever. And the assumption is that somebody who has reached an old age has learned a lot, has had a lot of life experience. This is why you have this idea of the grandmotherly figure. Which often, again, we normally portray that very positively as sort of a protective and wise type of spirit. But we also see this Baba, this grandmotherly figure, as something dangerous and devouring. Devouring because death is the devouring of the self. It's you are no longer you. Your consciousness is dissipated in some way, and your body is committed to the ground. I mean, you are done. So there is no more going forward in life. So we, as I have mentioned in many, many, many places over and over again, fear of death in all of its forms, even if it just means major transformation and change, is that this transformation and change, is something that some people deal well with change, other people do not. And sometimes even people who do deal well with change have periods of time where they don't. So, and then of course, if you lose someone that you love, when you have losses like that, losses of things that are important to you or that you have attachment to, it's extremely difficult. That's extremely difficult to deal with. So, so they represent these kinds of forces. So they're forces of nature. In this case, they're water spirits, and they represent the more malevolent aspects of water. If we go back to religious or mythological stories of floods, the Great Flood, right, that we see in Babylonian, Sumerian, and in biblical literature, this idea of this Great Flood. And what's the flood sent? The flood's sent to punish, okay, either a corrupt race or one that's overpopulating the earth. There's a sense of trying to regain a sense of balance or control. And as it's been pointed out, while fire utterly destroys and perhaps purifies, water regresses things. It puts things back at a stage that it was, puts it back at a beginning stage. Although water does also have a purifying function. I mean, obviously, baptisms are performed with water, for example. We bathe. I mean, regular hygiene is about bathing in water. So it has this purifying, but when it is a force to be reckoned with, when it is, we think about hurricanes and storms, but also there's this, whirlpools and, in this case, the duckweed. There's these other forces that are now being personified in these female hag forms. And I just find it interesting that there's this continuity throughout cultures of the hag form as somehow being, associated with this either cannibalizing or devouring children. Although, as we see in one case, they also draw the elderly in. When you see it particularly with young children, again, the idea of these lives that are cut off. Now, these particular figures don't discriminate. They're not going after young women necessarily. But to drown a child is, once again, you're resetting things, but it's at the cost of a loss of life. Perhaps that's why the quote-unquote sacrificial idea might have been there. We've seen bog people that have been placed in the water, and that in what's believed to be a human sacrifice kind of a ritual. So they may be representations of this monstrous force of nature that comes to claim somebody in this fashion. But again, when I think about what Lynn says about water as having a transformative power, that this sort of being again, like if you're baptized, your head is sometimes, at least in Protestant traditions, your head is held underwater and then pulled up again. So, and that's the idea that you are reborn, that something new has happened. And maybe it is appropriate that there's a hag figure that does that, who kind of acts as the gatekeeper between that old state of being and the new. So we've got some different ideas here. Perhaps all of them are correct. About the idea of the cautionary tale for kids: don't get too close to that water, or the water monster will drag you in. It could have been an explanation for drowning. So many people have drowned because there's a monster under the water dragging them in. Or it could also be, I think, on this more psychological and perhaps esoteric level, these can be ancient symbols of the transformation of the forces of nature. This movement into crisis. A lot of initiatory systems, water is part of them at some point. The idea of water or being in water, whether it be a baptism, whether it be some other kind of initiation into a magical society or something like that. Water tends to be involved in some fashion. So so this idea of the threatening feminine force, the threatening, devouring feminine force combined with water, it's another example of how we look at the powers of the earth as feminine in these different forms, as these kinds of monstrous women who threaten the life and the order that we have created for ourselves as humans. and the way in their own way in which they threaten the family, by dragging children underneath, or perhaps dragging, the elderly, meaning, the older, wiser people now are also being dragged in. But that may be to a different purpose. I mean, that may be legitimately in the sense of, okay, your life is over and you're starting again in some other kind of a fashion. So as again, I wish I had some actual stories of these. Generally, there's no specific story that's given. It's not as though we have a tale of a Jenny Greenteeth or a Peg Powler. It's just simply, if you get too close to the water, they'll drag you under. So, which is another reason that I ask, if you have any stories, or you know of somebody who claims to have encountered one of these beings, I would love to hear those stories in comments, or emailed to me at Chthonia@Chthonia.net, because I always like to kind of round out my view. I mean, we can talk about these things psychologically, we can talk about what they represent symbolically, but if there's any aspect, particularly of folkloric figures or figures that people tend to view as having some kind of a reality in the way that ghosts do, or that people feel ghosts do if they believe in ghosts, I'm always interested to know what people's experiences are. So with that, I'm going to end this podcast. Thank you again very much for listening. Please check out Chthonia.net for all of my work. If you wish to support my work, please visit patreon.com/Chthonia. And on social media, it's Chthonia Podcast, 2 words on Facebook, 1 word on Twitter and Instagram, and just Chthonia on YouTube. Thanks again for listening. Till next time.